Welcome everyone to today we're here with Danita, who is a fellow of the J.R. Smallwood Foundation and works with the Center for War Studies, of course, also. And we're here to talk about Danita's new project on sealing. So, Danita, can you tell us a little bit about the project that you're working on?
Yes, and thank you very much for having me. My project explores the events of and the fallout from the anti-sealing movement that particularly targeted Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, but which had many local, national, and international implications for people, particularly vulnerable people who are living in rural, isolated communities, as well as Indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere, including Greenland.
Absolutely. It sounds really interesting, but given that the anti-sealing movement was at its height in the 70s and the 80s, why do you think these issues of accountability, attitudes, and the events that you're looking into here are still important to examine today?
I mean, and that's a fair point. And the answer is quite straightforward, and that is that the implications of what happened in the 70s and 80s are still having an impact today. They have an impact on, for example, First Nations' ability to sustainably develop renewable resources in their homelands, the ability of rural communities to make the most of the resources which are at their disposal in order to preserve their local cultures and histories and traditions, and to stem issues of outmigration by participating in one of the range of seasonal fisheries that traditionally, for centuries, have made up the infrastructure of the economics of many rural communities throughout Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as northern Canada and Greenland. And what happened in the 1970s and 1980s still reverberates today in terms of, for example, the European Union remains closed to all sealing products coming from outside. There are some exceptions for Indigenous hunting and Indigenous sealing products, and certain governments and for example, the government of Nunavut, the government of the Northwest Territories, and the government of Greenland have all taken advantage of this clause. It's called the Inuit exception. But they also still face struggles, and there was a recent report that came out at the beginning of this year in which, for example, the government of Greenland called for the European Union to do more to help to tackle the stigma which is still placed on sealed products and sealing in general. So it still impacts people's lives today. Mm-hmm. And that's why this is particularly relevant in terms of the sealing aspect. Mm-hmm. More broadly, it also speaks to questions about the way in which NGOs go about tackling subjects, how they come together and do their work, their strategies, their tactics, their information dissemination, but also their information gathering, and tackling questions surrounding accountability of what happens when certain groups may disseminate misinformation. And in particularly in this modern day, when we're talking about the issues of fake news and social media and the quick dissemination of information with the lack of checking, it can have real life consequences for many people who may not have the same resources at their disposal that some of these NGOs have. And that's what a lot of lessons can be learned from the anti-sealing movement, both what happened and the fallout for the people who were left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any, based on your findings, are there any concrete recommendations that you can make, or what do they teach us sort of specifically? What can we do about this?
Well, I mean, this project builds upon some work that I've done with a colleague of mine called Teal Phelps-Vandroff. And we've worked on, for example, dispelling this misconception that the general public has about speaking about NGOs as this monolithic group. And that's certainly not the case. You know, the WWFs of the world are vastly different from organizations like IFAW or Sea Shepherd. They do different things. They have different focuses. They have different histories, philosophies, resource bases, and audiences that they target with their messages. So the project speaks in part to continue that message that we cannot paint all NGOs as the same. It also speaks to the issue of NGOs can evolve. And a key focus in this project is on Greenpeace. So part of the project looks at a lot of the work that Greenpeace did during the anti-sealing movement. And the reason why Greenpeace is focused on is that they took a leadership role in the anti-sealing movement during the height of the 1970s. And it was a new organization who was undergoing a lot of internal growth and changes and forming its own identity at the time. And as a result of its internal changes and growth and figuring out who they are and what they represent, mistakes were made. But the Greenpeace of 1977, for example, when they encountered some issues internally over the conduct of some of its members and how that may or may not have violated their idea of nonviolence, which is core to their identity today, does not necessarily represent the Greenpeace of today and what they try to do and what they try to add to global discourse about environmental protection and conservation. However, the Greenpeace of today grew off of what the Greenpeace of then did. So speaks to questions of accountability, but also of recognizing that organizations are not static. And this is something that we all need to acknowledge. And sometimes, particularly when you have levels of hurt, of having been hurt by certain organizations or movements, those nuances can be lost on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is something that the project speaks to and tries to find.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's also about lessons learned, I suppose, right? And how you
very much so
from that, and how you address these issues today. That's very relevant also for today, right? And how yes. NGOs tackle these issues. So becoming a little bit more concrete, what particular pieces are you working on at the moment?
So at the moment, one piece that I'm working on as part of this project is a piece exploring Greenpeace and the grounds upon which an argument could be made for Greenpeace apologizing to certain groups in Newfoundland and Labrador for its conduct in the 1970s in particular. And this isn't an advocacy piece saying that Greenpeace should support sealing or anything of the sort. That's not the point of the paper. It's about looking at what does Greenpeace stand for today and how has its conduct in the past led to issues of accountability gap. And this builds upon the fact that Greenpeace itself has come out and apologized a number of times, but most recently to Inuit in northern Canada. And in that apology for what it had done and what it had encouraged and been part of during the anti-sealing movement and the cultural and economic implications, negative implications of that for Inuit people in this case, there was also acknowledgement in that apology of the impact of their work on First Nations people in general in Canada, and to a small lesser extent, coastal people, which in that definition would include the rural communities of Newfoundland and Labrador, who traditionally for centuries in their own culture and traditions had participated in sealing as part of their survival, but ultimately had their livelihoods gutted as a result of the end of the sealing industry, or the vast decline of it. It still exists in a much, much reduced capacity, but it's nothing as it once was.
So in a way, if I hear that correctly, it's also about the people of Newfoundland and Labrador being sort of overlooked in this whole story, right?
Well, yes, but in two levels. One is about accountability to particularly the people in the 1970s and 80s who had their livelihoods undermined, their cultures publicly, nationally and internationally shamed and deliberately misunderstood and misconstrued it to convey a message of anti-sealing, but which ignored the local people and the impact and finding ways to help them. Because, for example, in one of the Greenpeace reports that I found from 1977, in their own report, they acknowledged that the average sealer had only a grade 9 education, had 3.5 dependents, and had very limited economic mobility. So knowing that, you still went ahead and encouraged activities that undermined their ability to provide for their families and live in their home and in their culture. And you didn't follow it up by trying to find ways of encouraging economic diversification. So you deliberately attacked a culture and a people who, by your own report, you knew had nowhere else to go and lacked the education to do something else. So it's about bridging that gap between mistakes made in the past and building upon the good work that they are doing to acknowledge accountability gaps, acknowledge organizational growth, and on the basis of what they state as their moral code and what they believe in, growing for everybody's benefit and creating healing and moving forward.
Fascinating. Now we also meet in this slightly weird setup here, right? Where we're talking on Zoom and we're recording it because of Corona restrictions and because of everything that's going on in the world this year. Can you maybe say a few words about how it is to do research like this during COVID-19 times?
Well, I mean, COVID-19 has had a major impact on my project, and I'm very fortunate that both Center for War Studies and STU have been very encouraging and helpful with my efforts to try to implement this project. Part of the reason, yes, is COVID-19 while we're doing this, but I'm also still in Newfoundland with travel restrictions and everything else. But also, I've had a lot of help locally. My funding body has been enormously understanding, dealing with issues of extensions and all the ethical considerations which come from trying to implement a project during a pandemic and the very serious health implications if someone does something wrong. So what concretely have I done different? Well, I've had to modify my project. So my project originally had plans to do a lot of interviews, and I've made the judgment call to suspend those for the time being because it's not worth the risk. I mean, we're quite fortunate here in Newfoundland and Labrador to have very low numbers of COVID-19 that have been detected, but the risk remains, and there are public restrictions about gathering, mask wearing, cleaning procedures. So for the sake of everybody's peace of mind, I have suspended that. I am aware that there are technological ways, telephone, I mean, that's been around for 100 years, and Skype, Zoom, and other avenues like that, that I could do interviews, but it's been my experience, having done quite a bit of field work now, that if you haven't met the person before and you don't already have some rapport with them, the quality of the interview like this, you don't get as much from it than if you had met the person before and this is just kind of a follow-up. There's already a rapport built. Yeah. So the project instead has been predominantly focused on archival research, which I have to give a big thank you to Colleen Field from the Center for Newfoundland Studies at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Memorial University of Newfoundland, who is an archivist based there at the Center for Newfoundland Studies, who has helped me enormously by helping me do the archival research via distance, because there's library restrictions. Universities here are closed or partially closed, and there's restrictions on my ability to access the library. And again, for safety reasons, I've been able to do a lot of this via distance. So a lot of this research that I'm doing at the moment is much more in a historical capacity, whereas my original intent was to have a mix of historical and follow-up on contemporary. But, you know, we're adapting. We're all adapting during this COVID-19 situation, and that's just how it's really been impacting my project for the time being. And maybe, fingers crossed, everything resolves, and then I'll be able to follow up on the other aspects of the project. Yeah, absolutely. We'll hope that. It's very interesting. Good luck with it. And thank you very much. Thanks for explaining a little bit to us what you're doing.